Oh my god. It's like they watched Matt Walsh's documentary on What is a Woman, saw how successful it ended up being despite all the misinformation that it pushed, and went, let's do that, but make it Australian. Hi everyone. So on September 3rd, 2023, 7 News Spotlight of Channel 7 in Australia put out a 53-minute hit piece titled Breaking the Silence, the Reality of Detransitioning, with the cover that reads, The Gender Agenda. You already know what's coming. The documentary follows the story of 3 detransitioners, Courtney, Chloe, and Mel, alongside providing commentaries on trans healthcare, social influence, and politics hosted by journalist Liam Bartlett. It is very clearly taking the same approach as Matt Walsh's documentary What is a Woman that came out on June of last year, which I already have spoken about on this channel multiple times now, but this obviously focuses more on the medical aspect of transition, especially involving children, the social influence, and of course, the detransitioners. So, without further ado, so let's start by making one thing absolutely clear. The rate of detransitioning, as in someone deciding to transition to the gender opposite to what was assigned to them at birth, realizing that it is not for them, that they've made a mistake, that they regret transitioning, and then going back to living according to their assigned gender, the rate of that happening is extremely low. A systematic review that conducted meta-analysis consisting of just under 8,000 transgender patients that went through any types of gender-affirming surgery, only 1% of them expressed some form of regret. So if you want to measure the success rate of gender-affirming surgeries based on how much regret the patients have after getting them, if only 1% regret getting them, then 99% do not, which means that gender-affirming surgeries have a 99% success rate, which is really good for a medical procedure. Yet the documentary tries to push this narrative that there are thousands of children transitioning and thousands of them are regretting it.
Children are being told they should change from boy to girl or girl to boy from as young as 12 years old.
Thousands of kids are doing it and regretting it.
Yeah, you know, there are so many children transitioning and so many of them are detransitioning that we couldn't even find enough of them in Australia. We had to travel all the way to California just to speak to one of them. Out of the 3 people that this documentary featured, only one of them, Chloe, began transitioning at the age of 12. They managed to find only one child who transitioned and then detransitioned, but even then, she wasn't even from Australia. They had to travel all the way to California just to speak to her. They then try to justify it by going, yeah, I know we're in California, but this may as well be Melbourne. You know, it's just like country Victoria.
She grew up here in rural California, best known around these parts for being the pumpkin capital of the world. But it may as well be country Victoria or outback Queensland.
No. The other 2 people, Courtney and Mel, started transitioning in their 20s, with Mel receiving a double mastectomy, the surgical procedure to remove your breasts, at the age of 26, and Courtney was scheduled to have her double mastectomy done at the age of 28 before deciding to opt out. So even in your late 20s, at 26 and 28 years old, if you still aren't old enough to transition and make decisions about your body, how old do you actually have to be trans? And almost every other trans person that this documentary features, they don't even regret transitioning. And for most of them, the documentary used their content without their consent.
Channel 7 kind of made it look like I regret transitioning.
So about a week ago, I was on the news in Australia.
Y'all, some random ass fucking Australian news channel used a clip of me.
I was absolutely horrified, deeply hurt and anxious to discover one of my videos was featured in this segment.
I've been made aware that Channel 7 News in Australia is using my images to promote transphobia.
Channel 7 News in Australia has used my image without my consent in an anti-trans news segment.
And it just keeps going. There is so much more. Australian trans influencer Grace Highland made it to news after calling out Channel 7 for using her images without her consent. Afterwards, Channel 7 did issue an apology and removed her images specifically, but the rest is still there. Something else that I've noticed about this Detransitioners, as someone who has been following issues affecting the trans community, been keeping tabs on this for over a year now, is that almost every detransitioner that gets propped up by the right-wing media is almost always a female. Not saying that male to female detransitioner doesn't exist, because I'm sure they do, and this is not just about this documentary in particular, but every time it is always a female to male transitioner that detransitioned and has gone back to living as a female that gets featured by these people. And the narrative is always, oh, these poor, vulnerable, fragile little girls who were just confused and troubled and were swept up by the gender cult, and now she has lost her voice, is left with regrets and wounds that won't heal. I guess transphobes view trans men as women, so the misogynistic tropes of women being naive and incompetent still applies. Which is funny, because when asked as to why these women transitioned in the first place, they cite sexism as the reason. Growing up as a girl in this society, they experienced body dysmorphia, objectification, sexism, and thought through transitioning into a man they could escape misogyny.
Do you understand how you got into the headspace where you thought, I would rather be a man instead?
Yeah, so back then I was getting a lot of male attention, and I didn't like that, and I thought, well, if I was a man, life would be so much easier.
I didn't really have any doubts about being a girl up until I was maybe about 11 or 12, when I would look at myself and I felt so ugly.
How did that begin?
Probably like through puberty. I had like quite a few experiences that were negative. Like I was sexually assaulted. And I feel like that was quite a big fuel for me wanting to transition and not be a woman anymore.
Because you felt what being a woman was making you vulnerable?
More vulnerable and like an easy target.
But it really doesn't work like that. When you start transitioning, especially early on into your transition, trans masculine people actually experience more sexual assault, violence, and stalking than trans feminine people. In every sector of life, from bathrooms to prisons, trans men are taken much less seriously, they are infantilized, and their issues rarely ever get any attention. So yes, once you start passing, maybe then you'd get treated like a man and escape misogyny, so to speak, but up until that point, you're actually in a much more vulnerable state than you would be as a woman. And I'm not saying all this to dismiss the things that these women went through. I am genuinely empathetic, especially for Mel. I really do feel for her, because she clearly has been through a lot, but the things that her and the other detransitioners have gone through that motivated them to transition has nothing to do with trans people, and there certainly aren't good enough reasons as to why other trans people shouldn't transition. If anything, I feel angry on behalf of Mel, as even at 26 years old, Liam Bartlett and Channel 7 still continue to infantilize her, exploiting her trauma and pain just to push an agenda. They try to present transitioning as this magic pill that would solve all of your problems, like all of your problems would disappear the moment you become trans.
You go ahead, take that testosterone, it'll fix everything.
Did she think changing her sexuality would solve all those problems?
That's possibly the case, that looking for an answer, looking for an out, looking for a solution to pain. I think so many of these kids are led to believe that changing the exterior will fix something.
I spoke to like a trans activist who was like, I felt the exact way you felt, like how you feel in your body and like what you deal with. And it kind of like really kind of solidified like, oh, transitioning could be like the solution.
Now, nobody is saying that. Contrary to popular belief, being trans is not fun. Especially right now, transgender people are one of the most persecuted minority in the world. Trans women of color are still being murdered at a disproportionate rate. This is something I'll go over more in another section, but the reason why trans and gender non-conforming people form such a robust community online is because the real world is still dangerous and unwelcoming for most of us. But I would still say that the concept of medical regret is an interesting one because to what extent would you deny treatment to a patient based on the fact that they might regret it in the future? How do you even measure regret? Not to mention, regret can change over time. While people like Courtney, Chloe, and Mel may regret transitioning now, in a few years they might look back and think it was the right decision, as living as the opposite gender could provide some unique insights, could solidify your gender identity, and who knows, maybe they'll go back and retransition. And many detransitioners do go back and retransition, as the initial reasons for detransitioning is often due to external factors like discrimination, social stigma, unsupportive family. So when these people finally do get to a safer environment where they can be themselves, they go back to being trans. But this point of regret still gets brought up, not just in trans healthcare, but say for abortion, contraception, sterilization. I'm not going to ramble too much on it here. I will link some articles for you to check out if you're interested. But at the end of the day, despite how much these people try to make it out to be such a horrible thing, detransitioning is really not that big of a deal. It's okay to experiment with your gender. It's okay to try out different things, see what you like and what you don't. And it's okay to go back too. That doesn't mean that you've made the wrong choice initially. And while this documentary features detransitioners who have had surgeries, most trans people don't. So for most trans people, detransitioning could be just as simple as stopping a medication, dressing a certain way, or going by a different name. You know, reversible changes. Like puberty blockers that are reversible, cross-sex hormones that are reversible, and the risks that do come with these treatments can easily be monitored and managed. Or that's what the current research says, but Bartlett and Channel 7 would say otherwise. During the research for this section of the video, I came across this video by Abigail Thorne from PhilosophyTube. I'll have that linked below. I think it is an essential video to watch for anyone interested in the state of trans healthcare, especially in the UK. In the video, Abigail goes over her experience seeking healthcare for her transition with the NHS system. That involved filing multiple complaints on various people, dealing with extended wait times, health professionals that just aren't trained in trans healthcare, all while coping with crippling dysphoria, making the whole process taxing and frustrating. Extended waitlist is a huge deal when it comes to seeking healthcare as a trans person, leading many to self-medicate or just die. And all of this is while seeking healthcare as an adult, and it's not even healthcare for that matter, it's just to get to your first appointment. Afterwards, there could be multiple more appointments to come, more health assessments, screenings, psychological evaluations before you can even get to your treatment. Abigail went through this whole ordeal as an adult in her 20s. So can you even imagine how much more hurdles, roadblocks you'd have to go over in order to transition as a child, especially if you have unsupportive parents? The most frustrating part about all of this is that if you actually look into what kind of medications are being prescribed to trans people, you would find that these are just normal medication that are prescribed to cis people all the time with no issues, oftentimes even more than trans people. Cis women regularly get prescribed estrogen to deal with menopause. Cis male athletes and bodybuilders are known for taking testosterone in forms of anabolic steroids to enhance performance. These are not trans medications. These are just medication that can be used for transitioning, but only when a trans person wants them. That is when they have a problem with it. Puberty blockers especially have been in all sorts of craze over the last couple years. Trans YouTuber Mia Mulder has this video on puberty blockers. Again, we'll have it linked below. I absolutely love this video. It's so informative. I think I've watched it 3 times already. But the Channel 7 documentary still tries to push the same old misinformation about puberty blockers.
So you don't like the idea of puberty blockers at all?
No. I mean, Sweden, I think, has outlawed them. It absolutely permanently destroys people. The bones, their sex drive. You can't just play with nature in that way. Puberty is a human right, and no one has the right to intervene with that, even if the patient wants it.
Never mind the fact that puberty blockers have been used for decades on cis children to treat a condition called precocious puberty, where a child can begin puberty as early as 5 years old. And no, Sweden did not outlaw them, but even if they did, you would not just be hurting trans children but also cis children who might need them. While yes, puberty blockers can lower your bone density, this is something that can easily be managed through regular visits with your doctor, which as a trans child you would have to do anyway. And if anything, it is expected that your bone density would reduce slightly on puberty blockers, as this study that measured bone density of over 200 cis girls, and as you can see, the ones who started puberty later had lower bone density. And as for fertility, yes, puberty blockers can cause infertility through reducing your sex hormones, but again, it can easily be managed through freezing your eggs or sperm while you're still young. Every medication will have its side effect. There is not a single medication in this world that is perfect with no side effects. So what we need to look at is whether or not those side effects are worth having. Are they manageable? Do they outweigh the positive outcomes? And as it stands, when it comes to puberty blockers, the positives do outweigh the risks associated with them. It's important to note that Courtney, even though she is outspokenly against puberty blockers in this documentary, she herself did not receive them. She started transitioning at 23 years old. By then she would have been too old for puberty blockers. Same with Mel, who began transitioning in her 20s. The only trans person that they could find to be in this documentary who transitioned as a child, they had to travel overseas just to speak to them. Yet they still try to push this narrative that transitioning is so easy, that children are being forced to transition.
Hypothetically, if I took my child to the gender clinic here in Brisbane, for example, how many times would I have to go before I could start that child on some sort of hormone treatment?
Well, I've seen kids see a social worker for 2 sessions and then be referred to the paediatric sexual health physician to start puberty blockers.
2 sessions?
2 sessions.
How many minutes would that be?
120.
Like, in what world? In Australia, it is practically impossible to transition as a minor without your parents' permission, and if your parents don't consent, then the family court might get involved, but even then, in most cases, there is not much you can do until you're 18 to be able to transition. They try to push the same narrative with Mel, who claims to have gotten treatment in under an hour.
So how many hours, minutes, days did it take before from the time you went to the doctor?
What do you mean with how long did it take to get diagnosed? Like under an hour.
Under an hour?
Yeah.
Like I mentioned earlier, Mel transitioned as an adult in her 20s. On top of that, she is also from Melbourne, which is one of the most liberal places in all of Australia. So yeah, as an adult, living in a progressive area, it would be easier for you to get help in this regard, but that is not the case for most trans people, and that is certainly not the case for trans children. The documentary is also heavily critical of the affirmative model to gender transition, claiming it to be a controversial view.
The affirmation model essentially means accepting someone's gender identity without question, even if they're a child. It's a controversial view.
Now, this is such a mischaracterization of the affirmative model. Affirmative model does not mean that you accept someone's gender identity without question. Traditionally, when someone wishes to transition, there are 3 ways it can be approached medically. The first is the corrective model, where if a patient wishes to transition, they would be refused immediately and would be corrected and fixed to not wanting to be trans anymore. Basically, conversion therapy, which has thankfully fallen out of practice in most places. The second is the resistant model, which is far more common and prevalent. This model builds upon the idea that if someone is truly trans, then they would go over whatever hurdles and requirements that the doctors throw at them and prove themselves to be worthy of transitioning. Going back to Mia's video, Mia actually went through the resistant model herself in order to transition, and I think her experience with it in and of itself is proof as to why this is not an ideal model.
I myself did a large part of my transition in that type of approach. I had to do real life experience where you live as your gender for a full year. And if I would go to my doctors wearing pants, they would basically write in their little notes that I wasn't really dedicated. The doctors would enforce a gender norm. And while I wanted to dress like the cave goblin that I usually am, in a tank top and pants like a normal person, but whenever I went to talk to my doctor, I would basically be forced to wear dresses and frilly tops and put on makeup and wear heels, because that is what they expected from me, and that is what a good trans would do if they are really trans.
Needless to say, this model enforces excessive medical gatekeeping, often by doctors who aren't even trans themselves, and it dismisses the fact that every trans person's journey and experiences would be different, and not every trans person would have the same symptoms and issues. But the affirmative model, all it does is that if you have a patient come in that wants to transition, they would be responded with, okay, we believe you, and here are the things that we can do to help you. It does not mean to accept them with no question, because there still will be medical assessments, screenings, psychological evaluations, etc., all those things involved, but it would be done on the basis of informed consent, with doctors listening and believing the patient instead of making decisions for them. That can mean to transition, or that can mean not to transition, as if the patient at some point decides that they don't want to be trans anymore and stop the treatment. That is fine too under the affirmative model. Nobody is forcing anyone to do anything. The affirmative model actually had quite a bit of success compared to the other two models. As it turns out, patients perform better when they're trusted by their doctors. But the documentary completely dismisses all of that and instead suggests something that is far more harmful and backwards.
We need to take a different approach towards children with gender dysphoria. We need to be able to say to them, we understand that you're in distress and that you're feeling really uncomfortable in your body, and we want to do everything we can to support you through it. But we know that the risks and long-term consequences of transition are so serious that we can't just assume that that's the right way forward. Because of this, we're going to continue to use your biological name and pronouns, but we're going to work with you to understand exactly what you're going through and do everything we can to try and help you.
So if you're not going to be affirming them and you're going to make sure that they have no way to transition regardless of how much distress that they're in because of the risks that you conveniently don't even mention, the only approach that is left to do is the corrective model. So conversion therapy. You essentially want conversion therapy for trans children. But at least you're being nice about it.
We want kids to grow up and be happy. We all want that. We don't want them to have regrets and serious health problems.
Yes, we all want kids to be happy and healthy. That is something that I hope we all can agree on. But as it stands, as a parent, affirming your trans child is the best thing that you can do for their health and happiness. That far outweighs any regret or risk of health problems. The data here is actually pretty clear on this.
And there's no evidence that social transition or puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones reduce the suicide risk in children with gender dysphoria.
Excuse me?
And there's no evidence that social transition or puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones reduce the suicide risk in children with gender dysphoria.
Throughout the documentary, they try to allude that this transitioning, experimenting with your gender is just a thing that kids are doing due to social influence. It's the phones, the internet, the social media that is luring these troubled and depressed teens to this gender agenda, promising them a sense of belonging.
You use a lot of online stuff, right? YouTube and all sorts of things. How much of an influence do you think, though, online material, the online community is for kids who may be suffering gender dysphoria?
Oh, absolutely. I think social media is the ideal modern day PsyOps platform more than anything. I mean, if you want to push any agenda, that's the way to do it.
Was she getting a lot of advice on social media?
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%.
I found a history on her computer and the web browser history of transgender sites and searches. Oh, it just blew my mind.
I was like 16, 17. I was just looking for a sense of belonging.
And to prove that, they just play the contents of various queer and trans influencers online, which I don't really feel comfortable showing because, like I said, most of their content was used without their consent. But there is this one TikTok that they kept playing all throughout the documentary that I just had to make an exception and show you, because let's just say that it got on my nerves, to put it nicely.
Happy Pride Month. Here are the top 5 reasons to be trans. Number 5, the goddess of transformation will whisper to you all of her secrets. Number 4, happiness. Kind of boring, but it's true.
Now, this is obviously a joke. It's sarcasm. But they still keep on playing this all throughout the documentary as this scary, ominous thing, probably because it is the only thing that they could find that at least claims to be pushing some sort of an agenda.
Number 3, it's so cool. It's so trendy. It's very in right now.
But the only term to describe what this documentary is alluding to that is vaguely scientific, if you can even call it that, is rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD for short, which is something that I've already talked about on this channel. ROGD is a term coined by physician Lisa Littman in her 2018 paper titled Parent Reports of Adolescents and Young Adults Perceived to Show Signs of a Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria, where she claims that gender dysphoria among young, assigned female at birth people is largely due to peer pressure and influence from social media. Her paper has since been retracted and discredited by multiple institutions due to its failure to obtain ethics approval, as in her paper that was about young trans-masculine AFAB people, she fails to get any input from these people. Instead, she reaches out to their parents via surveying them from anti-trans websites. You know, it's like going, "What is it like being trans?" We asked some transphobes. As Eli Coleman, former president for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, puts it, to even say it's a hypothesis at this point based on the paucity of research on this, I think is a real stretch. Right now, if you were to look up Lisa Littman's paper, it would come with a corrections notice that would lead you to a list of everything that is wrong with the study. But despite all this, Channel 7 and Liam Bartlett continues to run with this narrative, focusing on the amount of children that is wanting to transition or experiment with their gender in a fear-mongering tone.
I've come to Victoria, which has the most radical laws in the country when it comes to gender identity. It also has the busiest gender clinic for children and adolescents, with over 1,000 patients being seen at Melbourne's Royal Children's Hospital.
Now, at first, this might seem concerning, but when you take into account that there is over 5 million children in Australia, 1,000 of 5 million is 0.02% if you want to round it up, which is hardly anything. But you know, 1,000 children does sound a lot more alarming than 0.02%. I understand that it still may seem like a lot of children that are coming out as trans or non-binary or anything other than cisgender heterosexual, but do keep in mind that this correlates with the culture shift that we've had where being LGBT+ is becoming more normalized and socially accepted. Oftentimes, people of this realm would cite this graph to show a surge of children, particularly AFAB children, being referred to the gender clinic, which has a similar pattern to the amount of people coming out as left-handed between 1900s to 1976. Now, does that mean that there is a secret agenda to turn your children left-handed? Oh no, the left-handed cult is coming for your children! No, rather the likely explanation is the social and environmental factors. Prior to 1900s, being left-handed was stigmatized. It was believed that left-handedness was evil, improper, and less skilled. Left-handed students especially would get punished and discriminated against at schools for using their left hand. Once all of that subsided, there was a surge of people coming out as left-handed. And it's not because all of a sudden it was now cool and trendy to use your left hand, but the likely explanation is that the people that were coming out as left-handed were already left-handed to begin with, but rather were forced to assimilate and hide that part of themselves due to social stigma. Another study that is often cited by these people is this one from the UK, where 98% of 12 to 15-year-old trans children moved on to using cross-sex hormones after being on puberty blockers, claiming that this proves that the doctors and the gender ideologues are forcing children to transition instead of ignoring the obvious, which is that maybe these children really were transgender and just moved on to the next step for their well-being.
Otherwise, people are literally killing themselves. It's literal violence. No, it's not. It's just, it's a lot of white suburban kids who feel this, they feel disconnected from reality, they feel depressed, they feel inadequate. Oh, but if I transition, I'll be special.
Now, look, I genuinely am happy for Courtney. I am happy that she is at a place where she is comfortable with her gender. But it is a huge mischaracterization to assume that every trans person will have the same experience as hers. Not every trans person is some privileged white suburban kid wanting to transition just to feel special. For some people, it is a painful, agonizing process to live in a body that you don't belong in. People really do kill themselves over this, and because of people like Courtney who continue to dismiss the struggles of these people, they're left with no other choice but to turn online. And once you do transition, your problems don't automatically disappear, because trans people routinely face systemic discrimination in all facets of life. You may have heard of the statistic that 40% of transgender people attempt suicide at some point in their lives. In Australia, it is up to 50%. An online trans and queer community can provide that support that many trans people do not have in real life. It can be an amazing resource. Despite all its drawbacks like overzealous activism and cancelling, for some trans people, the online community is all that they have. But part of this documentary's problem is that they continue to keep mixing up gender and sex.
As a mother or father, what would you do if your child told you they were now the opposite sex?
This is crazy. I said, you're not a boy. That you're simply not a boy. People can't change sex.
Across Australia, there are 7 facilities that treat and medically assist adolescent children to change their sex.
A lot of these children are promised something that cannot be achieved. It is not possible to be the opposite sex. It's just a fact.
At this point, I don't know how many times this needs to be reiterated, but here we go again, I guess. Sex and gender may be used interchangeably in various contexts, but those two are completely different things. Sex refers to a set of biological characteristics, the physical differences like your chromosomes, genitalia, and the organs that you were born with. Gender, on the other hand, is a social construct. It's how the person identifies and presents themselves. It has no basis on objective reality, but rather is a result of social interaction. There is no biology textbook in this world that will tell you that say if you're a man, if you were born with a penis and XY chromosomes, then you'd have to have short hair, wear pants, and go by he/him pronouns. These are societal rules and expectations that we've made up that are subject to change and varies across different countries, cultures, and various time periods throughout history. During the aristocratic times, it was a sign of nobility for a man to grow out his hair and wear high heels. In Scottish culture, they have the traditional male clothing of kilt, which is basically a skirt. In some languages, like in Bengali, which is my native language, we don't even have gender pronouns. Rather, we use the same set of pronouns for everyone regardless of their gender. In the previous section on trans healthcare, I mentioned how they suggest a much more harmful approach in place of the gender affirmative model, where they said they would prefer to keep calling trans patients by their biological name and pronouns.
We need to take a different approach towards children with gender dysphoria. We need to be able to say to them, we understand that you're in distress and that you're feeling really uncomfortable in your body, and we want to do everything we can to support you through it. But we know that the risks and long-term consequences of transition are so serious that we can't just assume that that's the right way forward. Because of this, we're going to continue to use your biological name and pronouns.
What do you mean by biological name and pronouns? Your name is not biological. Pronouns are not biological. It's language, it's linguistic, that is subject to change. I can't believe I even have to explain this. So when we say that somebody is a transgender man or a transgender woman, we are mostly referring to their psychological and social identity. Because yeah, you cannot change your sex. Sex is biological. Why else would you think trans people transition? They transition to change their gender, to alleviate gender dysphoria. A trans woman who was born with XY chromosomes is still a woman because your social and psychological identity is just as valid as your biological one. But most of you already know this. In fact, I bet even Liam Bartlett and 7 News knows this. At this point, they have to be aware of the fact that they're spreading misinformation. I mean, they had to travel overseas just to find one person that would fit their narrative. So if this documentary is not about educating people, as they clearly have no problem spreading misinformation deliberately, what is this really about? I mentioned at the start of the video how this documentary felt very similar to Matt Walsh's documentary What is a Woman that came out last year, on which I've already made a video about. Go watch it if you haven't already after this. But there is no point where it was felt more than ever when they started rambling on about freedom of speech and how the gender affirmative model silences people and nobody can say anything anymore.
Is this issue a little bit poisonous for a politician?
It's very poisonous. I was scared to talk about it because lots of people get attacked when they talk about this issue.
Here at the moment, they have more than 900 patients on their books. But one thing they all seem to have in common is secrecy. Despite our continued requests to the medical bosses who run these taxpayer-funded clinics to answer questions about how they make their life-altering decisions, all we hear is silence.
Oh my god, they are so dramatic. They also brought in a supposed child psychiatrist who apparently got suspended for raising some valid concerns.
Do you think the hospital want to sack you?
Yes.
And honestly, this is giving me Maya for starter, which if you know, you know.
It's not just their refusal to speak that's worrying. It's the refusal to listen to those who speak out.
This is pretty funny coming from them because when they released the trailer for their documentary on Twitter, they made sure to turn off replies. They also disabled the comments on their YouTube channel. But I've noticed this a while ago as well, especially with the voice referendum that happened a while back, which is that the politics here in Australia is turning more like American politics. Very sensational, very little care for the accuracy of the information presented. I mean, as long as it makes for a good story and riles people up, who cares? Am I right? They eventually did find someone to speak to, Professor Ian Hickey from the University of Sydney. Now, Professor Hickey did do a really good job at this debate. He absolutely obliterated Bartlett. I'm not going to show much of it here because there really isn't much for me to add, but also it doesn't matter because Bartlett is not here to listen. He is not looking to change his mind. Throughout the debate, he continues to talk over and interrupt Hickey, making the whole thing frustrating to watch. I mean, just look at the way he even introduces this debate.
Next, the most fiery interview of the year.
Like, just look at the smirk on his face. He does not care as to whether he is right or wrong. He is not here to listen, to learn. He just wants to rile people up through this fiery interview, even if trans people end up getting hurt in the process. They also try to appeal to the whole big pharma conspiracy theory, throwing in a little sprinkle, some razzle-dazzle, by saying that children being able to transition is some kind of a medical scandal.
You call it a medical scandal.
Yes.
Do you really think it's that bad?
Yes, absolutely. In Australia, hundreds, if not 1,000, over 1,000 children who have been commenced on this pathway, whose puberty has been stopped, and they've progressed onto treatments with cross-sex hormones and surgery, and those children's bodies have been irrevocably changed and harmed for the rest of their lives. There's no other word for it in my view. It's a medical scandal.
This feels like a very uniquely American conversation to have, because I feel like this argument would only work under the context of privatized healthcare, the kind that they have in the US, where doctors would do anything to squeeze as much money off of you as possible. So it feels odd to have this kind of a conversation in Australia, because here in Australia we have universal healthcare. We also have one of the highest minimum wage in the world, so there is no logical reason for the doctors or the pharmaceutical industry to be doing this. But say even if they were doing this, say there really were some kind of a medical scandal to trans as many children as possible to make money, trans children are like a minority of a minority, 0.02%. Even if they were doing this to make money, it is a pretty ineffective way to go about it, isn't it? Just... why are we even talking about this? I don't know about you, but I don't want this kind of politics to be coming into Australia. This sort of very sensational, very polarizing, either left or right, heated debate, fiery interview where no one learns anything, but at least we talked about it. No, just no. Stop. Please stop. Just stop it.
Stop it. Get some help.
In conclusion, Channel 7 has lost their goddamn mind. You might have noticed that I'm being especially hard and snarky in this video. It's because I am just so sick and tired of hearing and debunking the same arguments over and over and over again. I'm particularly disappointed at the fact that this insanity, this moral panic has now traveled to Australia. Like, come on, I thought we were better than this. In all seriousness though, I really hope you found this video useful or at least entertaining. Even though most of you probably already know about the things that I spoke about, I hope you still learned something new. I am not even trans, yet I found it difficult to sit through some parts of this documentary, so I cannot even imagine what it's like for you if you're trans. It's almost the end of the year though, so at least that's good. Hope you have a good Christmas, New Year's, Hanukkah, or whatever holidays you celebrate at this time of the year. And even if you don't celebrate anything, I hope at the very least you get to relax and have some time to yourselves, especially if you're trans, because it's been quite the year, hasn't it? That's pretty much it from me for today. Thanks for watching, especially if you made it till the end. Leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Stay safe, take good care of yourselves, and I will see you next year. Bye!